Welcome, Awer, Anda, Dumlong, Molo, Sawubona, Who can that? And a warm welcome to the Anduva Knowledge Cast, the podcast where your curiosity meets insightful conversations. Today, we're diving deep into the world of IFRS 5. That's International Financial Reporting Standard 5 for those keeping score at home. Now, before you switch over thinking this is just for the accountants, let me tell you, this is about how companies play the game when they want to sell stuff off. And trust me, knowing the rules can be a real leg up, especially here in Masansi.
You're absolutely right. IFRS 5 might sound like something you'd find in a textbook, but it's actually quite relevant to anyone interested in business, investing, or even just understanding how the financial world works.
Okay, so let's paint the picture for our listeners. Imagine a big company like, say, one of those mining giants we have here in South Africa decides to sell off a whole mine. Or maybe a retailer like, Pick and Pay suddenly decides they're done with clothing and wants to get rid of that whole section. That's where IFRS 5 comes in. It sets the rules for how companies have to handle these kinds of big asset sales.
That's a great way to put it. IFRS 5 basically provides a framework for how companies should account for and report on assets they've decided to sell off. It ensures transparency for investors and helps maintain a level playing field in the market.
All right, so let's unpack this thing. The first big question is, when does a company actually slap that for sale sign on an asset? The source material we have mentions this concept of highly probable. It sounds a bit vague, to be honest.
Well, think of it like this. Let's say you're thinking of selling your trusty old Backy. Now, just thinking about it isn't enough to trigger IFRS 5. You need to have a solid plan in place. That means management has approved the sale, you've got a mandate from the board, you're actively looking for buyers, and you've even got a reasonable asking price in mind.
So it's not just about a casual action, maybe I should sell this. It's a deliberate and committed decision. Like this Backy is going, I'm getting a Hilux.
Exactly. And IFRS 5 is very specific about this. The sale needs to be highly probable, which means more than just a 50-50 chance. There has to be a strong expectation that the sale will actually go through.
Okay, so management commitment, active marketing, a decent asking price, it's all starting to make sense. But what about the time frame? Does they have to sell it overnight?
Well, not overnight, but IFRS 5 generally looks at a one-year time frame. The expectation is that the sale should be completed within a year of classifying the asset as held for sale.
Ah, so there's a deadline. But what happens if, say, Eskom decides to sell off a power station and, things get a bit complicated? It takes longer than a year.
That's a great question. IFRS 5 does recognize that real-world complexities can sometimes delay these transactions, as long as the company can show that they're still actively trying to sell the asset.
Yeah.
And the delay is due to factors outside their control, like regulatory hurdles or legal challenges. They can still keep it classified as held for sale, even if it takes longer than a year.
So there's some flexibility, but they still have to be able to justify the delay. Transparency is key, right?
Absolutely. IFRS 5 is all about making sure that companies are upfront with investors about what they're doing with their assets. Now, speaking of transparency, let's move on to the next big thing. How do they figure out what price to put on that for sale sign? I mean, you can't just pull a number out of a hat, can you?
Especially if it's something big, like a whole mine. You'd think they'd want to get top dollar, right?
Well, IFRS 5 introduces this concept called fair value less costs to sell. It's a mouthful, I know. But it basically means that you have to look at what a willing buyer would realistically pay for the asset, after taking into account all the costs involved in selling it.
Okay, so it's not just about what the asset is worth on paper. It's about what someone is actually willing to pay in the real world. So like with a house, you've got to factor in things like agents' fees, transfer duties, all that jazz.
You got it. Those costs eat into your profit.
Mm-hmm.
And IFRS 5 makes companies account for that. It forces them to be realistic about their pricing.
So no more inflating prices to make things look better than they are. That makes sense. But what about those costs you mentioned? How do they even figure out those costs to sell, especially if the sale is expected beyond 1 year?
Now, that's where things get a bit more technical. IFRS 5 requires companies to consider the present value of those costs. It's a way of accounting for the fact that money today is worth more than money in the future. They use a discount rate to adjust those future costs to their present value.
Okay, so they are bringing those future costs back to today's RAND value. That ensures a more accurate picture of the transaction's true value. I'm starting to see how knowing this stuff can give you an edge when you're looking at company financials.
Exactly. IFRS 5 helps you read between the lines and understand what companies are really doing. Now, before we move on to those big see you later moments, let me ask you this. What if a company decides to sell off a whole chunk of its business, not just a single asset?
Ooh, that's like when a retailer decides to close down all his furniture stores, or a bank sells off its entire insurance division. Big moves. I bet IFRS 5 has something to say about that.
You bet it does.
Mhm.
That's where we get into discontinued operations. It's basically when a company decides to say humba kali to a significant part of its business.
Okay, so it's not just selling off a backy, it's like selling the whole dealership. Big difference.
Yeah.
But how does IFRS 5 define what qualifies as a discontinued operation? Is it just based on size? Like how much money that part of the business brings in?
Well, size is definitely a factor, but it's not the only one. IFRS 5 has some pretty clear criteria here. The operation needs to represent a major line of business, a separate geographical area, or even a whole subsidiary that was acquired specifically to be sold off later. And there's another important factor. It has to be a strategic decision, like a major restructuring or a shift in the company's overall direction.
So it's not just a matter of closing down a few underperforming stores. It's a big strategic move that's going to have a significant impact on the company's future.
Got it. But why does it even matter how they classify this?
Well, think about it from an investor's perspective. You want to know how the core business is doing, right? If they're lumping in the results of a discontinued operation with everything else, it's hard to get a clear picture of the company's actual performance.
It's like trying to figure out how much boars you ate at a braai. When someone keeps throwing chicken wings on the fire, the numbers get all mixed up.
Exactly. So IFRS 5 forces companies to be transparent about these discontinued operations. They have to present the financial results of those operations separately in their financial statements. So investors can clearly see the impact of the sale and how the core business is doing on its own. So it's all about giving investors the information they need to make informed decisions. Makes sense. But hang on a second. What happens if they put up that for sale sign, go through the whole process, and then for some reason the deal falls through? Do they just stick the asset back on a shelf and pretend nothing happened?
Not quite. That's where we get into what we might call the abandoning ship scenario. Sometimes those big deals just don't go through. Maybe a buyer pulls out at the last minute, or the market conditions change. But IFRS 5 doesn't let companies just sweep this under the rug. They have to account for that change in plans.
Okay, so they can't just pretend they never wanted to sell it in the first place. What do they do then? Do they just go back to business as usual?
Well, not exactly. IFRS 5 requires them to reclassify the asset as held for use, basically acknowledging that they're no longer actively trying to sell it. And here's the key thing. They have to reevaluate the asset's value based on its original cost and its remaining useful life.
So it's like when you try to sell your old car but can't find a buyer, you might have to accept that it's not worth as much as you thought and adjust your expectations accordingly.
Precisely. And that readjustment might mean taking an impairment loss, which can be a bitter pill for a company to swallow, but it reflects the economic reality of the situation.
And of course, IFRS 5 makes sure they disclose all of this to investors.
Absolutely. Transparency is paramount. Investors need to know if a company has had to write down the value of its assets, as this can impact their profitability and future prospects.
This IFRS 5 is starting to sound like a financial watchdog, making sure everyone is playing by the rules.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about promoting fair play and making sure the market has accurate information. Now, before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, where we'll be looking at the nitty-gritty details of what companies have to disclose about these asset sales, let me ask you this. Why should our listeners even care about all of this? What's the takeaway here?
That's a great question. Well, I think the key takeaway is that IFRS 5 isn't just some dry accounting rule that only accountants need to worry about. It's about understanding how companies make decisions, how they value their assets, and how they communicate with investors.
You're absolutely right. And whether you're an investor, an entrepreneur, or just someone interested in the business world, understanding IFRS 5 can give you valuable insights into a company's financial health, its strategic direction, and even its overall ethics.
Well said. Stay tuned, folks, because in part 2, we'll be digging even deeper into the world of IFRS 5, exploring those all-important disclosures and looking at some real-world examples of how these rules play out in the South African context.
Welcome back to the Ndubo KnowledgeCast.
We've been unpacking this whole IFRS 5 thing, which, let's be honest, sounds way more intimidating than it actually is. It's really about lifting the curtain on how companies handle their assets when they're looking to offload them.
Exactly. It's like giving you X-ray vision into their financial dealings, especially when they're thinking of selling off parts of their business.
And we left off talking about how companies have to fess up when those big asset sales don't go according to plan.
Right. That whole abandoning ship scenario. It's like when you try to sell your old car on Gumtree,
Yeah.
and despite all the photos and descriptions, it just sits there gathering dust.
And you finally realize, okay, maybe it's not worth as much as I thought. Back to Auto Trader we go.
Well, companies have to do something similar when they abandon a sale. They can't just ignore it. IFRS 5 requires them to reclassify the asset as held for use and reassess its value.
So they have to face the music and admit they might have been a bit too optimistic about the sale price.
Exactly. They have to
Yeah.
go back to the drawing board and figure out the asset's current worth, based on its original cost and how much longer it's likely to be useful.
So it's back to depreciation 101.
Precisely. Now, this might mean they have to take an impairment loss, which can hurt their financial statements, but it's all about reflecting the true economic reality.
And of course, IFRS 5 makes sure they tell everyone about this little accounting adventure, right?
Yeah.
Transparency for the win.
Absolutely. They can't just hide this information from investors. Speaking of which, that brings us to one of the most important aspects of IFRS 5, those all-important disclosures.
Yes. The part where companies have to spill the tea about those assets they're trying to sell.
Imagine you're buying a house. You wouldn't just hand over your hard-earned cash without knowing everything about it, right? Any dodgy plumbing, cracks in the foundation, you want to know it all.
Especially if you're in Joburg. You need to know if that roof can handle a proper hailstorm.
Exactly. IFRS 5 works in a similar way. It requires companies to give investors a detailed Carfax report of the assets they're trying to sell. This includes everything from why they're selling to what they expect to get for
So
it.
it's not just about slapping a price tag on it.
Yeah.
They have to provide the context, the backstory,
Yeah.
the whole shebang.
You got it. They have to explain the circumstances of the sale, what kind of profits or losses they've made on the asset while it was classified as held for sale, and even which part of the business the asset belongs to, like their fancy Santon office block or that struggling coal mine down in Mpumalanga.
So it's like those Wood Stutes disclaimers, but way more detailed and with a lot less fine print.
Think of it as a way of protecting investors, making sure they have all the information they need to make informed decisions.
No more buying a used car without knowing its history.
Now, remember those discontinued operations we were talking about earlier? Those big strategic moves where a company decides to say goodbye to a whole chunk of its business?
Like when Edgar's decided they were done with selling furniture.
Well, IFRS 5 requires companies to be super transparent about those too. They have to tell investors everything. Why they're discontinuing the operation, what the financial impact will be, and how it's going to affect their future earnings.
So it's not just about getting rid of the furniture. It's about explaining to investors how that's going to change the whole Edgar's experience.
Exactly. And these disclosures are super important because they help investors understand the true story behind the numbers. They can see how the core business is performing without that discontinued operation, which helps them make better investment decisions.
It's like separating the chocolate from the pap. You can appreciate each part better on its own. So we've talked a lot about how IFRS 5 protects investors. But what about the companies themselves? Does it benefit them in any way?
Well, think of it like this. In the business world, trust is everything. When companies follow IFRS 5 and are transparent about their asset sales, it builds confidence among investors. It shows they're playing by the rules and being upfront about their financial dealings.
So it's like having a good credit score. It makes you look more reliable and trustworthy.
Exactly. And that can make it easier for companies to attract investors, secure loans, and even negotiate better deals. It basically levels the playing field and makes the market more efficient.
It's like having a good reputation. People are more likely to do business with you if they know you're straight up.
Now, let's take this a step further and bring it closer to home. Let's say you're looking to invest in a South African company. You're clipping through their annual report, and you see a bunch of assets classified as held for sale. What does that tell you?
Well, first I'd check if they've got a good rugby team. Just kidding. But seriously, it could mean they're streamlining their operations, getting rid of dead weight. That could be a good sign, right? Shows they're being proactive.
It could be, but it could also be a sign that they're trying to raise cash quickly, maybe to cover some losses or pay off debt. That's where those IFRS 5 disclosures become your best friend.
Right, because those disclosures would give me the juicy details. I could see why they're selling, what they expect to get for it, and if they've had to take any big impairment losses. It's like having a backstage pass to their financial decision-making.
Exactly. And don't forget about those discontinued operations. If a company is getting rid of a major part of its business, that's a big red flag. You need to understand why they're doing it and how it's going to affect their future earnings.
So IFRS 5 is basically like a financial detective's toolkit. It helps you analyze the clues and figure out what's really going on.
Well said. Now, all this talk about assets and sales might seem a bit abstract, so let's bring it to life with a classic South African example. Imagine a company like, say, SAB decides to sell off one of its breweries.
Ag shame, no more Castle Light. But seriously,
Yeah.
that would be a big deal, right?
Yeah.
What would IFRS 5 require them to do?
Well, first they'd have to classify that brewery as either a held-for-sale asset or a discontinued operation, depending on how significant that brewery is to their overall business.
Right, so if it's just a small craft brewery they picked up in Woodstock, it might just be held for sale. But if it's their main brewery in Joburg, that's a whole different story.
Exactly. And then the disclosures come in. They'd have to tell everyone why they're selling, how they determine the fair value of the brewery, any costs associated with the sale, and how this is all going to impact their bottom line.
So it's like giving investors a guided tour of the brewery, pointing out all the important bits and explaining what's happening and why.
You got it. Now let's say you're an investor who loves Castle Light. Seeing this announcement might make you think twice about holding on to your SAB shares. Or maybe you think it's a smart strategic move and a good opportunity to buy more. Either way, IFRS 5 gives you the information you need to make that call.
It's like having a cheat sheet for the JSE. But this IFRS 5 thing isn't just for big companies like SAB, is it? What about us regular folk?
Well, while we might not be dealing with breweries and mines, the principles of IFRS 5 can actually apply to our personal finances too.
Now you're talking my language. Tell me more.
Think about it. Whenever you sell something of value, like a house, a car, or even that vintage Springbok jersey you've been holding on to since the '95 World Cup, you're essentially engaging in a mini IFRS 5 exercise.
You're saying I should be classifying my old sneakers as held for sale.
Well, maybe not officially, but the core principles still apply. You need to figure out what it's worth, consider any costs involved in selling it, and be transparent with potential buyers about its condition.
So IFRS 5 isn't just some fancy accounting standard. It's a set of guidelines for making smart decisions about our assets, whether we're running a multinational corporation or just trying to declutter our garage.
Exactly. And it's all about being honest, transparent, and accountable.
Well said. Now, before we move on to part 3, where we'll wrap up our deep dive into IFRS 5, I want to leave our listeners with a little homework. Think about the last time you sold something. Did you consider its fair value? Were you upfront about any issues?
It's a good reminder that IFRS 5 isn't just for big shots in boardrooms. It's a set of principles that can help us all make better financial decisions, even when we're just trying to get rid of that old couch.
Welcome back to the Indubo Knowledge Cast for the final part of our deep dive into IFRS 5. We've covered a lot of ground, from classifying assets to those all-important disclosures. But before we wrap things up, I want to make sure we connect all these dots for our listeners.
You're right. It's important to bring it all together and highlight why understanding IFRS 5 can be so valuable, especially here in the South African context.
Yeah. Exactly. We've talked about how companies have to play by the rules when they're selling off assets. But how does this actually play out in the real world? Give us some Mzansi flavor.
Well, think about the recent wave of mergers and acquisitions we've seen in South Africa. Companies are constantly buying and selling businesses, restructuring their operations, and trying to stay ahead of the curve. IFRS 5 is right in the thick of all that action.
Okay, so it's not just about selling off a mine or a brewery. It's about those big corporate shuffles where companies are merging, acquiring, and reshaping the business landscape.
Yeah.
But how does IFRS 5 actually impact those deals?
Well, let's say a big South African bank decides to acquire a smaller fintech startup. IFRS 5 requires them to carefully assess the fair value of the assets they're acquiring. They can't just inflate the price to make the deal look better. They have to be realistic and transparent about the valuation.
So it's like when you're buying a house. You get a valuation to make sure you're not overpaying. IFRS 5 is kind of like that. But for businesses...
Exactly. And those disclosures we talked about earlier play a crucial role here. Investors need to understand how the bank arrived at the valuation, what assumptions they made, and what risks might be involved. It helps them assess whether the acquisition is a smart move or a potential disaster.
Right, because sometimes those big acquisitions turn out to be more trouble than they're worth. IFRS 5 helps investors avoid those voodoo situations in the corporate world.
Precisely. And it's not just about mergers and acquisitions. Think about the restructuring we've seen in industries like mining and retail here in South Africa. Companies are constantly having to adapt to changing market conditions, new technologies, and even political shifts.
Like when those big clothing retailers had to close down a bunch of stores because everyone started shopping online.
Exactly. And when companies go through those kinds of restructuring, IFRS 5 is there to guide them. It requires them to be transparent about the assets they're selling off, the reasons for the restructuring, and the impact it's going to have on their financial performance.
So IFRS 5 is like a roadmap for navigating those big corporate shakeups, making sure companies are being upfront with investors and making sound decisions.
Exactly. And that transparency is crucial for maintaining investor confidence and ensuring a healthy and stable market here in South Africa.
Okay, so IFRS 5 is like the referee in the big game of South African business, making sure everyone's playing fair and the market is working as it should. But what about the average South African? The person who's not necessarily buying and selling companies or poring over financial statements, why should they care about IFRS 5?
Well, think about it like this. When companies make sound financial decisions, when they're transparent and accountable, it benefits everyone. A healthy and stable market leads to economic growth, job creation, and a better standard of living for all South Africans.
So it's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. When businesses are doing well, the whole country benefits.
Exactly. And IFRS 5 plays a role in that. It promotes good corporate governance, encourages responsible decision-making, and ultimately contributes to a more prosperous and equitable South Africa.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, let me ask you one last question. We've talked a lot about the technical aspects of IFRS 5, but what about the human side of things? How does this standard impact people's lives in a tangible way?
That's a great question, you see. Behind all those numbers and accounting rules, there are real people whose lives are affected by these decisions. When a company decides to sell off an asset or discontinue an operation, it can have a ripple effect on employees, suppliers, local communities, and even the broader economy.
Right, like when a mine closes down in a small town. It's not just about the numbers on a balance sheet. It's about people's jobs, their livelihoods, their entire way of life.
Exactly. And while IFRS 5 doesn't explicitly address those social and economic impacts, it does promote a culture of transparency and accountability, which can help mitigate those negative consequences.
So it's about encouraging companies to think beyond the bottom line and consider the broader impact of their decisions.
Precisely. And that's why understanding IFRS 5 is so important. It gives us a framework for analyzing those decisions, holding companies accountable, and advocating for policies that promote sustainable and equitable economic growth.
Well said. I think we've covered just about everything there is to know about IFRS 5, from classifying assets to understanding those all-important disclosures. We've explored how this standard shapes the way businesses operate, how investors make decisions, and even how it impacts the lives of everyday South Africans.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners have gained a new appreciation for the complexities and nuances of this seemingly dry accounting standard.
Absolutely. Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding these rules can empower you to engage with the business world in a more informed and meaningful way.
Well said. And as always, we encourage you to stay curious, stay informed, and keep those deep dives going.
Sharp, sharp. Until next time, from all of us here at the Induba Knowledge Cast.